R.J. Snell has spoken for the Thomistic Institute in the past, and he gave a lecture at the University of Virginia entitled Made for Love, Why Do We Exist? I recommend that you look it up and that you listen to it. And as I was listening on my way to a doctor's appointment, I was just kind of being blown away in the car. I was like, wow, this is beautiful. I think the type of experience that one might have while reading Leisure, the Basis of Culture by Joseph Pieper, something along those lines. For me, it was just very, I felt my spirit ennobled and I felt my gaze lifted towards higher things, and it made an integrated life seem possible. So it's my pleasure to introduce R.J. Snell, who is the Director of Academic Programs at the Witherspoon Institute and the Academic Director of the Aquinas Institute. He's also a contributing editor of Public Discourse. Formerly, he was a professor of philosophy at Eastern University and did his academic work at Boston College and at Marquette. His research interests lie in the way of natural law, St. Thomas Aquinas, Bernard Lonergan, and the Catholic intellectual tradition. Some recent monographs include Through a Glass Darkly, on the work of Lonergan and Ayres, another including Authentic Cosmopolitanism, and The Perspective of Love. To round out the scoring and lead us home in the final stage of our conference, please join me in welcoming R.J. Snell.
I offer my thanks to Margarita and to everyone involved with Scala for putting this on. It's an enormous amount of work, and while there are co-sponsorships with Thomistic and Aquinas, it really is Margarita and her crew who have done everything, or at least I haven't done anything. So thank you so much for that, Margarita. It's really I'm also grateful to the Thomistic Institute for its involvement. They've been doing such excellent work for such a long time, and it really is always a real honor and an encouragement to be involved with the work coming out of DC and everywhere else that Thomistic Institute is involved in. So thank you for that. It's also a real honor and treat for me to be able to share a conversation with other faculty and professors some of whom I've known for a long time, or at least I've known their work and admired their work for a long time, and very grateful to Professors Kidd and to Titus, and of course to Margarita and Anna as well. So thank you so much. Really, really a treat. Perhaps nothing is so intrinsically, instinctually celebrated, desired, and praised as love. We are, many of us, like Augustine, in love with love. And how can we not be? Because love really is a grand and many splendored thing, isn't it, after all? And of course, more than our experience of love, we know that God is love. We know that the greatest of all human virtues, theological one of course as well, is love. And we know that the mandatum, the new and greatest commandment given to us, is to love even as God loves. And so of course there's good reasons for us to be in love with love and to take love so seriously. Still, my patience for Valentine's Day diminishes steadily the older I get. And we know that the claims made on love's behalf are oh so grand, aren't they? Love, you know, makes the world go round. Not only that, but even better, love covers a multitude of sins. And love means never having to say you're sorry. Which is very convenient given that all is fair in love and war. So there's no need to apologize or to confess so long as you were doing it for love. On second thought, scratch that. Maybe all is fair in love, but not in war, because the sages counsel us to make love, but not war. Wise words, those. What can love in the end not do? Those philosophers of all time, the Beatles, reminded us that love is all that you need. We're reminded of the power of love in one of the greatest of the 80s films, Back to the Future. Love is greater than fear. And lest we forget or doubt, remember, love will find a way. Love is capable even of solving the thorniest of moral issues, because love is love and love wins, and there is only one love. Although all too sadly, love apparently wins only so long as love lasts, because love in the end is fickle. Now, you'll gather from my assortment of bumper sticker cliches, and that actually was my Google search, bumper sticker cliches love. You'll gather from my assortment of bumper sticker cliches, tossed together like so many of those candy hearts in Valentine's Day, that I've come to suspect that we don't have a firm grasp on the meaning of love. Now, apropos of nothing except candy hearts and Valentine's Day, the Babylon Bee had a very funny story yesterday of candy hearts from the Song of Solomon. Your hair like a goat's, your neck like an ivory tower, and my favorite, your teeth, spelled U-R, your teeth like sheep. But I come to suspect that we don't really know what we mean by love most of the time. For many, love seems to become, or at least in its words, seems to become not much more than a set of aspirations, as opposed to a definition, or an essence, or a reality. More like an empty screen upon which to project our wishes while circumventing the hard work of moral reflection. Love is like a mirror, reflecting no more than our self-love, our hopes for what love could be. Now, of course, another name for such a mirroring reflection of self-love is idol. Love is often idolatrous, or at least a false version of love is idolatrous, competing for our affection and veneration with the one true God who really is love. We often say, for example, love God and do what you want, again quoting Augustine. But what we really mean, which is not what Augustine meant, is do what you want, for God loves you. And those are not the same thing. One is true, the other is idolatrous. Our thinking about love tends to be, I think, in my own experience, often morally unserious. Not much more than sentimentality, sort of warmed heart, full of good intentions. But beyond squishy sentiment, though, we often ignore the real and palpable dangers of love. Love's always a good thing in the cliches, rarely a bad one. Love is praised incessantly, but we pay very little attention to its madnesses and pathologies and disorders. At weddings, one waits to hear, waiting to hear, love is patient and love is kind. But it could just as well read, love is jealous and love is blind. My wife rejected that suggestion at our wedding for reasons that are not obvious to me. I believe it's the New King James Version. But love can be jealous. Love can be blind. Love can be fickle or possessive or cloying or consumptive. Love can be unrequited, unwanted, unwarranted. Love can be obsessive or possessive, a madness, in fact. Love stories are not always happy ones, perhaps even rarely so. The clear-eyed realism of the book of Genesis, or the very clear-eyed realism of Christ's passion, or the basic principle of the universe of the lamb slain before the foundation of the world, reminds us that love's story is not a bloodless myth. The Disney version is far sweeter and far less true. It's just sentimental. Love hurts. Love scars. Love wounds. Love marks. Some of you of a certain age are humming one of the world's great karaoke songs to yourself just now. It's not as though the tradition has overlooked the dangers of love, after all. One of the greatest texts on love, Plato's Symposium, which is a series of speeches and conversations which take place after the feast over drinks, takes as its task, or putatively so, the praise of love. But the speakers, each in their own way, warn that love can be earthly, or shallow, or careless, that love can be abject or ridiculous, causing the lover to beg and bribe and lose dignity, even as the beloved can be dishonored or rendered dishonorable. In the text, one of the most moving images, that given by the character of Aristophanes, the selves were round, cleaved in two, however charmingly put, is a tale of each self which exists seeking their other half, their completion. Because each of us who are lovers exist as deeply and fundamentally wounded, as cut in two, as wounded at the very origin and core of our psyche and being. It's not a happy story. It's one where the human being as human is wounded, bereft and unhappy. Socrates, always a truth teller, insists, whatever the others say in their false sometimes praise of love, Socrates insists that love is not a god because love is not full. Love is a lack, according to Socrates. It's a lack of beauty. It's more like ugliness than it is like beauty, actually. Love is a lack of goodness. It's a lack of fullness. In Socrates' account, love is the child of want, the child of poverty. As Socrates states it in the Symposium, love is not delicate and lovely, but harsh and arid, barefoot and homeless. Near the end of the text, Alcibiades, one of the world's great seducers and lover, makes his entrance. But of course, Alcibiades mainly loves himself. And his life, because he is such a lover, or is the lover of the sort that he is also one of a life of great tragedy, a tragedy beyond most people's imaginations. And so this feast of love, the symposium, is not just a praise of love's infinite goodness. Love, it turns out, is not so pristine. Love can be cruel and base. It can be humiliating, impure, and tainted. Robert Spemann, the recently deceased German philosopher from whom I cribbed the title of my talk, warns that the demonic mysteries often enter into the feast of love. Now, the program description for this conference indicated that we were going to try to attempt to draw upon the resources of the Christian tradition to offer something more robust than the sentimentalism which often shapes discussions of love, friendship, and happiness. And it seems to me that sentimentalism really does rule the day. And of all the sentiments, the one which seems especially destructive to love's feast, or I'll suggest this for your reflection and consideration, perhaps objection, the most demonic of all the sentiments is what Daniel Mahoney, in his recent book called The Idol of the Age, what he says is the humanitarian impulse of love. One which, in his words, has begun to corrupt Christianity itself, reducing it to an inordinate concern for temporal and political things, along with a misunderstood sense of egalitarianism. As he puts it, Christianity loses its transcendental reference points, and the Christian vision of love devolves into a bland humanitarian benevolence, one incapable of recognizing the true, or at least the Christian, account of the Ordo Amoris, the order of love. Now, here I'll look briefly at two manifestations of what I take to be the disordering of the humanitarian sentiment. I have no grand solutions or syntheses, they're just reflections. Here's the first. Does love need to be blind? This is something that Professor Kidd mentioned earlier in her talk. Does love need to be blind, that is, unknowing of my particular relation and particular interest and the particularity and peculiarity of love? Namely, I really do not love all humans. I love this one or that one because he is close to me or she is close to me. One of the challenges of a kind of humanitarian sentimentalism is that we are supposed to love humans as if they're interchangeable. And I think that's a mistake. And second, is my desire for my own happiness and well-being something about which to be suspicious? Does the genuine impulse towards love require that I do not seek my own happiness because my love is pure? I'll explain both of these as we go on. And I'm relying quite heavily on a text by Robert Spemann and just a lesser degree a text by Michael Sherwin. So first, particularity or peculiarity. Does the humanitarian sentiment call into question and make me view with some suspicion the particularity of my embedded loves? David Hume encapsulates so much of the modern problematic by declaring that we can never get beyond ourselves. In epistemology, particularly of the early modern sort, this means trying to get out of the trap of our own intellect. If we can never get beyond ourselves, then we can never get beyond our own mind. In modern politics, this is the attempt to maintain our own sovereignty at the expense of flailing about and never being able to understand or attain the common good because we're trapped into our own sovereignty. In contemporary or modern morality, a conflict which made no sense to the ancients or to the medievals, a supposed conflict between the desire for my own happiness and the desire to be ethical or good, as if there is some incredible battle between my desire to be well for myself and the desire to be moral. That makes no sense to Aristotle, but it defines the textbook of the modern moral philosophy course. Now, when it comes to love, we seem to be trapped in the supposition that love is a passion or a sentiment, a feeling as opposed to the will. And thus we need to get out of that feeling somehow, out of this sentiment in order to get to genuine and true love. Now, there's something which is sort of true about the idea that genuine love involves a kind of feeling or emotion. Imagine if I showed up yesterday for Valentine's Day with an enormous bouquet of roses, and I gave them to my wife, Amy, and I said to her, I give these to you with no pleasure at all. I have no flutters. I have no warm heart. My breath and heart is perfectly steady because my love for you is pure and disinterested. That would be odd. And if I dare may speak for her, not well received. At the very same time, no one should suppose that I do not love because I am not always thinking and feeling for my beloved. Very often I am not. Instead, love is more of a habitus, a disposition, a firm and unchanging possession of my soul, such that I think with love when I think of her, and because I love to think of her, I think of her often. But it is not as if I am always thinking or always feeling, because I have a habitus, or a firm disposition. That's how most virtues are. Now, on an analogy to knowledge, I don't need to be actively thinking in order to have knowledge about something that I know. If I know how to do a particular activity, like ride a bike, I don't need to be thinking about how to ride a bike or actually riding the bike in order to have the knowledge of how to ride a bike. It's a habitus. It's implicit and tacit. But there's a disanalogy between knowledge and love on this respect as well, which is that real knowledge is never equivalent merely to a mental state or a reflexive intentionality about being sure or certain that I know. No matter how certain that I am that I in fact know, I can be wrong. For it is not my certainty which guarantees my knowledge, but rather the correspondence of my judgment to reality. It is reality which guards and checks my claims to knowledge, not my mental reflection about my own surety. I cannot know that I know simply by observing my mental states about my own knowing and being convinced that I am certain. The ignoramus and the blowhard have just as much certainty of their knowledge as does the real expert. But here's the disanalogy. Love does in fact require a state of mind or a state of soul or a disposition. When I think of her with love. And because I love to think of her, I think of her often. If when I think of her, I do not think of her with love, I do not love her. So there has to be an intentionality or a disposition or a mental state of some sort, I haven't defined what that would be yet, in order for it to be loving. Absent that loving intentionality, I do not love. Now, at the same time, love is not purely about my internal dispositions, because love is not blind. Ubi amor, ibi oculus, where love is, there is the eye. That is, love sees. Love has reasons for its love. It sees something which is lovable, something which is attractive. If I do not have reasons for my love, or if I do not know the reasons for my love, then I probably do not love. Or at least I do not love truly. I have only warmth or attraction, but I do not yet have love. Now, one of the oddities about that dialectic, the fact that I must have a mental intention of love, but that intention cannot simply be warmth, but has to be about reasons. And if I do not know those reasons, I do not know that I love. One of the oddities about that is that I can never be entirely sure that I do in fact love, or that I love as I ought. Take marriage. In marriage, as I understand it, one makes an indissoluble and irrevocable pledge of love, and for reasons. One has reasons for this. But if in time the person to whom I made that irrevocable pledge for these reasons changes so much that the reasons no longer apply, that they become negated, then you can never actually be sure that you actually do love as you originally pledged to love, or that you love the person of the future as you ought to, given the marital state. Now, of course, it seems to me that it is a mainstay of Christianity that you do not ever know if you love God as you ought to love God. That you do not, in fact, know if you have charity, or at least not into the fullness of the thing. And that hope precedes charity. And that you are, in fact, in most cases, hopeful that you love, rather than knowing that you love. Or to put it another way, You cannot be entirely sure ahead of time what kind of love you have, whether it is concupiscent love or benevolent love or love of friendship, or we use terms from Aquinas. Concupiscence as opposed to benevolence, although I'm going to here for the shorthand equate benevolence and friendship. Aquinas has some fine distinctions, but I'll overlook here, mainly because I don't understand them. Now, concupiscence here does not mean original sin or the wounds of sin. For those of us who formed in a certain tradition, the word concupiscence has a negative connotation. It implies that which is already disordered or already inordinate. In this context, it does not imply that. Concupiscent love means that something is loved for the good that the object brings. That is, where we love it for this reason, as that reason relates to myself. I desire this good, and I wish to bring this good to me, and to unite it to myself. All love seeks to unite. In concupiscent love, which does not need to be disordered concupiscence, I desire to unite the thing with the thing as that thing brings benefit to me. But that needn't be lust or inordinate, simply the desire for myself. And as I delight in the goodness of this thing, I make reference to my delight in the thing. That is concupiscent love. It needn't be disordered. It just makes reference back to my delight or my use in the thing. Now, we're immediately suspicious of that description, or at least I am. How can such love be pure? Wouldn't it be better, more like love, if I was disinterested? I remind you of the Valentine's Day flowers. My darling, I have no concupiscent love for you. That sounds good. But by no concupiscent love, I mean I do not delight in you. That would not be a mark of love or well received, again, I suspect. Now, of course, it matters what sort of delight we have. I can delight by means of the other, or I can delight in the other. If I bring a Valentine's Day gift in order to bring delight to myself, such that I bring a gift in order that her receipt of the gift will bring me delight, then I am instrumentalizing or using the gift and using her. That is to delight through, or by means of. If, on the other hand, I delight in the other, that is quite another thing. And a concupiscent love which delights in the other is still concupiscent, and yet would be a natural good love, or a naturally good love. It in fact would be quite appropriate for me to give a gift and to delight not only in the pleasure that the other has in the gift, but to delight in the other, which is why I'm providing the gift. That would be concupiscent and perfectly ordered and naturally good. Still, I'm suspicious, and I suspect some of you are as well, that if I was going to define any kind of love with reference to my delight in the other, or my enjoyment of the other, that there's something which smacks about an impurity to that love. Something which smacks about that not being true love, but merely being use. And furthermore, what do I do with the particularity? I happen to delight in this spouse on Valentine's Day, not just any spouse on Valentine's Day, or spouses on Valentine's Day. You can imagine I was showing up to my neighbor's house with an enormous bouquet of flowers and saying, I have true loves, I do not bring loves to my particular spouse. I bring flowers to a spouse, because spousehood is good. Again, it would not be received well. I don't think. I remember Amy and I were counting how many Valentine's days we had spent together. She says it's 25, I say it's 24, because the first one doesn't count. And here's why. Some of you know this story. The first Valentine's Day that Amy and I went out to each other, and this story actually is relevant to the sense of it not just being any human that is loved, but this one. We went out for what I thought was a Valentine's Day date in the mountains of the Blue Ridge in Virginia. It was beautiful. There's lightly falling snow. The angels were singing. She looked amazing. I was funny and tall and had lots of hair. As we were walking down, she kept slipping and holding onto my arm. And I thought, this is going pretty well, because it wasn't that slippery. And then at about 2 o'clock, she said, I need to go. We need to get back to the campus, back to the dorm. And I said, oh, how come? And she said, well, I have a Valentine's Day date to go to. So I was, in fact, not the Valentine's Day date. I was a morning distraction. My response to that was not, oh, it is good that two humans are getting together. Because concupiscence does, in fact, relate to particular relations. Me to her. I love children, but I love my children, frankly, more than I love your children. As it ought to be. But that is the question, in fact. Caught up in that is, in fact, an enormous debate, and I don't claim to solve it all, and every one of these instances are not the same. An enormous debate going on about the implications of sentimental humanitarianism just now. Namely, may I delight in my children more than yours? May I delight in my neighborhood more than yours? May I delight in my religion more than yours? May I delight in my country more than yours? Not to suggest I've solved all of that in those random examples or about cute Valentine's Day story. But those are in fact some of the implications caught up in the question of sentimental humanitarianism. So I do delight in and enjoy the other, and that is concupiscent love, ubi amor ibi oculis. But what is it that I see when I delight in this good? Well, I see, first of all, a good. I note furthermore that my feelings are not the good. Rather, my feelings are about or of the good, but the feelings themselves are not the good to be sought. However, this good that I enjoy when I see and love is not a universal good. It is this good, this particular good, this person in front of me, this child of mine, not that child of general humanity. In the eyes of love, I see, as it were, what God sees, why God created this person just now as this good. This person in particular, and in love I approve. I say, probus, it is good that this person is here as this person now, and that it is good that this person is here in her unique particularity. Don Calacho, the Colombian aphorist, I'm going to misquote it, he has a wonderful line where he says, one learns to love when one finally understands the reason or the necessity for God creating this person as they are just now. That is irreducibly particular. It has nothing about the generically beige human in front of it. And because the person is good, I ought to delight, which remember is concupiscent love. I ought to delight in them, and I ought to delight in them with my own particular affection, and with the particularity of my affection defined by my relationship to them. Sort of classic example that gets it wrong from modern moral philosophy textbooks. Two children are drowning, one is mine, one is not mine. Which one ought I to save? This is not a real question. Of course I save my child, it is mine. Another false question from moral textbooks of the age. Two children are drowning, one of them is mine. And because they are mine, they are an average intelligence and capacities. The other child will go on to say, cure cancer. Which one ought I save? A false question which does not understand human relationships in any way whatsoever. It does not understand love. I save my child, because it is mine. Aquinas asks, without any hint of embarrassment, questions which would embarrass us in our age. Namely, ought I love some people more than I love others? He asks, ought I love my father more or my children more? Ought I love my wife more, or ought I love my mother more or my father more? These are questions which embarrass us, but not to him. They're not embarrassing, because they reflect the nature of human particular relationships and the embeddedness, not just of duties, but the embeddedness of goodness in those relationships. We rejoice in the good that is in front of us, even if they are concupiscent, and that is naturally good. But of course, I don't delight in these things simply because they are mine, not just that they're mine, but rather that the particular relationship that exists between me and them is a good in and of itself. It's true that it is a good which is defined to the particularity of the relationship, but it's not given its goodness because it's mine. It's given its goodness because it is a particular and substantive relationship which is defined as the relationship between this I and that thou, where neither of them are reduced to impersonal relationships, but neither of them are reduced to mere general human. I do not love my child because it is my child and reflects back on me, but I do love and delight in my child because my child is an irreducibly non-repeatable thou, and she and I have an irreducibly non-repeatable relationship which can never be replicated or replaced. Not because it is mine, because that is the nature of the goodness of that relationship, and it ought to be rejoiced in. I find myself oddly worked up about that. Now further, in concupiscence and merely natural love prior to Gracie, I wish I had a kind of lack and a kind of poverty. But that does not render it not love. My weakness and my poverty and my need does not render my natural concupiscent love not love or impure love. Love needs the other, and love wants to be loved by the other. Poverty is not impurity here. Take Jesus as an example. In the great verse in the New Testament, we are told that he who is equal to God, form of God, empties himself and becomes poor. As poor, he needs the love of his mother. Not generic mother, this mother, Mary. Not just any old mother, not the woman down the street, but this woman. This woman who offers him hospitality, who gives him home, who gives him enfleshment, who gives him DNA, who nurses him. And she is not replaceable. There's no way to make sense of the Christian story where Jesus is given birth via artificial womb. It has to be her. And the fact that there is the particularity of her and the fact that he needs her and cannot be without her fiat in no way diminishes the purity of his love for her or her love for him. Instead, it renders it human, oh so human as love. Concupiscent love thus, or this is my claim, or that even the particularity of my concupiscent love, the love in which I delight and which in the end is defined by its relationship to me, is not untoward. There is no real and moral requirement for me to have such a pure love that I am disinterested, take no delight, and find nothing peculiar or particular to love, but instead must have a disinterestedness for the generic human. That's the first, the particularity of love. Second, what about my love for God? I love God. I desire to love God. Let's put it that way. I desire to love God, and I desire to enjoy Him forever. Because that is what I understand happiness to be, to know and enjoy God forever. Now, if I take a position of suspicion, or I have a too thick understanding of the purity of love, then my desire to know and enjoy God forever, the old catechism answer, or different catechisms actually, it becomes nothing more than a kind of hedonism or egoism about which to be suspicious. Do you love God because you love God, or do you love God because you wish for God to make you happy? Do I have to, in fact, require of myself that I do not wish to enjoy God forever so as to know that I purely love God? Or even more, to put it more starkly, do I have to, if I really love God, somehow bracket off or reduce from my concerns the desire for my own salvation and instead be governed by love of neighbor rather than my desire to be saved? Do I have to evacuate the vertical hope I have for salvation in order to have merely a horizontal hope so as to indicate that I really do love God and thus deserve heaven? See the starkness of the question? If I desire to be saved and enjoy God forever, do I thereby not deserve to enjoy God forever? No. No. Grace builds upon nature, and grace presupposes nature. It's one of the central themes of Titus's talk this morning. It's also a central theme of the Thomistic tradition. Because grace presupposes and builds upon nature, there is no coherent way for the God who I worship to have created a universe where grace is counter to or violent to nature. In no way can grace undo nature. At the same time, grace perfects and elevates nature, such that the grace of charity begins with concupiscence. Again, I do not mean by this disordered love, just love defined with reference to me. And as charity is added, as the grace of charity is added, this turns into benevolence or friendship as opposed to merely concupiscence, but without ever evacuating or rescinding the natural goodness of concupiscence which goes before it. Charity goes beyond concupiscence and gives us friendship with God. Charity never evacuates or undoes concupiscence. Let's think about how that works. God loves me and demands my love in return. It is a duty of nature that I offer right worship to God. It is a duty of nature that I know God exists and I wish to exist in right relationship to God, and that I offer right worship to God. It's a duty of nature. Now, how pure must that love be? It demands my love. How pure must it be? Do I have to rid myself of concupiscence? Do we almost have to not want to love God in order for our love to count? Do we need to love Him even without hoping to know Him? No. Now, this was a real debate in the medieval period. You can see debate between Richard and Hugh and Aquinas and Bernard. A question of whether grace has to destroy nature so that nature is no longer what it was or what it is so that we can become something else. No. In concupiscence, we draw the good to ourselves. In benevolence, on the other hand, or friendship, we will the good not for ourselves, but we will the good for the other, and we will to bring the good to them. Now here's the interesting point. Including, in friendship, so if in concupiscence we're willing to unite, we wish to unite with the other by bringing them to us. In friendship, we will the good for the other, including willing to bring to them the good which we are. It is not simply that we wish to bring some generic good to them. In friendship, I will the good for them, and I will to unite the good which is myself to them. Because ourselves are good. There's no death to self there. Because there cannot be joy and peace in a system which requires self-immolation. Now, I think one of the conclusions to follow from that is that natural love of God is perfectly legitimate. It's simply that it must be, in the end, subordinate to a full love of God, because grace follows nature. Even in natural love, we love God more than we love ourselves, Aquinas says. It requires one to think a little bit. Even in natural love, Aquinas says, this is love without grace. Even in natural love, we love God more than we love ourselves, because insofar as we're reasonable, we love good things as they are good. And God, being first and final, our final end and our perfection, insofar as we love our perfection, and we love our perfection knowing that that perfection is friendship with God, then we love God more than we love ourselves, because God is the reason for our love. That's hard, I think. In charity, says Aquinas, we still love our own well-being. It is not as if in concupiscence we love our well-being, whereas in benevolence or friendship, now with praise or charity, we do not love our well-being. In concupiscence, we love our well-being. And in benevolence, we love our well-being. It's just that in charity, we love our well-being. I'm going to call it, we want our salvation for the sake of God's glory, to bring glory to God. I think of that as a remarkable answer. If I have a kind of sentimental humanitarianism, a misunderstanding of the nature of love, the question of salvation, both for myself and my desire for the salvation of others, can feel untoward. I should love my neighbor's good, but not love their salvation so much. It's very strange to think about, actually, how I could love my neighbor's good but not love their salvation. If I love their salvation or wish their salvation in order to instrumentalize them somehow, that would be a problem. In charity, however, I can love my own salvation, I can desire fervently my own salvation, and I can desire fervently the salvation of others, not for myself, and in the end, not even really for them, but because I wish for God to be glorified, because God's good purposes and God's good work can be enacted and fulfilled. I wish to glorify God, and thus I wish to bring to Him goodness as it is, including I wish to unite with God the goodness that I am, such as I am, which is not much. I wish unity with God, but not simply to bring Him to me, but to bring me to Him, and to offer myself to Him as a very small gift for His own glory. Now that, of course, matters because the merits of Christ become our own, and so what we offer to God is the merits of Christ. So it becomes a perfectly appropriate gift. There can be no gift greater than that. Now, the reason I'm bringing that up, and I'll be very quick, the reason I'm bringing that up is the hesitation or allergy toward the conversation, the vertical conversation about salvation. I find that one goes weeks without hearing about salvation from the pulpit and the homily. Or one goes not so long before one hears about horizontal humanitarianism. Do not misunderstand me. Do not misunderstand me. Archbishop Chaput was mentioned earlier. I admired very much. He told me once, flat out, you cannot go to heaven if you do not love the poor. You cannot go to heaven if you do not care for the poor. But the purpose, fundamentally, of the story, I suggest, is heaven. And the purpose, fundamentally, of the story is the recapitulation of all things into their perfection, which is friendship and union with the triune God. And any other goal is too small if any other goal becomes final. And if, out of a kind of sentimental wariness, we're afraid that concern for our own salvation and the salvation of our neighbors somehow diminishes the horizontal level of friendship and care for the world, we don't understand, I think, that we seek salvation not for ourselves. That would be merely concupiscence. We seek salvation to bring glory to God, who has sought that task for